Good evening, everyone. As you're coming in, would you please mute yourself?
How we view or how to talk,
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. We're so excited to hear what Matthew has to say tonight about Thomas Merton. So thank you for joining us. I'm Lori Freudenberg. I'm from the Our Lady of the Prairie Retreat in Wheatland, Iowa. And on behalf of the Retreat Center and Genesis Spiritual Center in Westfield, Massachusetts, and Rolling Ridge Retreat and Conference Center in North Andover, Massachusetts, I welcome you tonight. And I'm thrilled that so many again are going to join us for what I'm sure will be a very insightful, wonderful evening. So first of all, please mute yourself. And then after Matthew's done speaking and he takes questions, go down to the reactions button on the bottom of your screen and you can raise your hand. And Dennis will call on you to ask questions of Matthew when we're ready for that portion. So please settle back and get ready for a wonderful night. And let me just introduce Matthew Fox. Reverend Dr. Matthew Fox is an author, theologian, and activist priest. He's been calling people of spirit and conscience into the creation spirituality lineage for over 50 years. His 39 books, lectures, retreats, and innovative education models has ignited an international movement to awaken people to be mystics, prophets, contemplative activists who honor and defend the earth and work for justice. Matthew today is an Episcopal priest after having been expelled from the Dominican order to which he belonged for 34 years by Cardinal Ratzinger, for one, being a feminist theologian, and two, calling God Mother, and three, working too closely with Native Americans. He tries his best to wear these badges of honor with humility. So with that, welcome Matthew, and you are on mute. There you go. Oh.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Thank you for calling us together. And good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you, to be speaking and sharing together about our brother, Thomas Merton. Just a few words of background to him and me. Let me begin with the painting behind me, which is the cover of my book on Merton, which is called The Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journey. The artist who painted this, and gave me permission for the cover, is Jewish, and he's part of the Jewish Renewal Movement with Rabbi Zalman Schachter. But Rabbi Zalman Schachter had a wonderful relationship with Thomas Merton. He tells a story how he would visit Merton, and he visited him several times. They had a long correspondence as well. But he'd visit Merton in his hermitage in the monastery in Louisville, near Louisville, Kentucky. And in the evening, they would sit on the outside porch and chant psalms in Hebrew and in Latin together. And that was part of their friendship. But I love this painting, and it's done, I want to share this, it's done on a Mexican basket. It's really quite special. And he has some Hebrew dedication here too. He calls it Thomas of the Desert. And on my 80th birthday, a friend of mine bought this from the artist to give it to me. So that's why I have it in person. And I thought it would be a good background for tonight. And of course, to have the Buddha with him, because Thomas Merton was a real pioneer, absolute pioneer in deep ecumenism. And his last journey was a journey east, where he met Dalai Lama, who was only 33 years old at the time, and they hit it off so well that both canceled their meetings for the next day so they could have 2 days together. And years later, the Dalai Lama visited Merton's grave at the Gethsemane, Our Lady of Gethsemane Monastery outside Louisville. And I think I may have told you the story already, that our journalist interviewed the Dalai Lama just a couple of years ago, and he said, "Do you believe in God?" A lot of Buddhists don't talk about God and don't necessarily say they believe in God. And the Dalai Lama said, he paused and he said, "Well, yes, I believe in God." Well, then the journalist said, "What kind of God do you believe in? Who is your God?" And he paused for quite a long time. And then he said, "The God of Thomas Merton," which I think is quite a compliment to Merton. Put that on your resume. Merton was also very close to Thich Nhat Hanh. In fact, Thich Nhat Hanh nominated Merton for a Nobel Peace Prize. And also he was very close to Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, the weekend that King was martyred, they had scheduled, Thich Nhat Hanh, Merton, and King had scheduled a retreat together at Merton's monastery. And just a few days before they were to meet, King called Merton and said, "I'm sorry, I have to march with garbage collectors this weekend in Memphis, so we'll have to get a rain check." So, of course, the tragedy happened. And of course, Merton writes in his journal, what might have happened if we had kept our date. So Merton clearly was a man of the world, even though he was a Trappist monk, and the Trappists are very strict. They're very vegetarian, and they're not supposed to talk, but they invent sign language, and they cheat sometimes. But the point is that they live a life of great austerity and silence, a lot of silence. And they do get up like the old monks used to do in the Middle Ages. They get up in the middle of the night, literally, to pray around midnight or so. And so their sleep is interrupted. And then Merton felt a call toward the end of his life to live in a hermitage. So I think it took him 6 years to convince the abbot to let him do that. So they built a little hermitage, a room, really. I've been there. I'm sure some of you have too, on the property, where he could be alone a lot. Although he did attend the liturgy often with the larger community. Now, I received an invitation on the 100th anniversary, the centennial of Thomas Merton, to give a talk in Louisville, sponsored by the Thomas Merton Center, which is set up at Belmont College. And Merton set that up just before he died. All his papers are there and so forth. And there's a wonderful Englishman named Paul, I forget his last name now, who runs the place and has devoted his whole life to be there at the Bellarmine University. And there are rumors going around that they're going to change the name of Bellarmine to Merton University, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But they've invited me several times to speak, but that was for the centennial. They asked me to talk about Thomas Merton and myself, and I said, well, okay, but I'm going to bring a third person in, and that is Meister Eckhart. So I talked about the three of us. So it's on the basis of that invitation and that thinking that talk out that I then later expanded it and wrote this book. And the title, A Way to God, comes from a personal correspondence I had with Merton. Because when I was studying theology, I went to my superiors, being a Dominican, and I said, you know, my generation is going to be less interested in religion, more interested in spirituality. And we don't have anyone teaching spirituality here, no one with a doctorate. So you should send someone on to get a degree in spirituality. And I'm happy to volunteer, nominate myself. So they came to me 6 months later and said, good news, you can go to Europe and study spirituality. I said, oh, wow, great. What a blessing. I said, where do I go? Well, they said, why don't you go to Spain? Spain, I said. We don't need more 16th century Spanish spirituality. Thank you. Well, they said, go to Rome. I said, Rome for spirituality? You're kidding me. Well, wise guy, they said, where do you go? I said, I don't know, but I know where I don't want to go. Let me write Thomas Merton and ask him where to go. And this would have been 1967, early 1967. And they thought I was crazy, right? Thomas Merton. But I wrote him a letter and told him a little about myself. And in 4 days after I sent the letter, I got a letter back, a full-page letter, very generous of Merton. And he said, go to Paris, go to the Institut Catholique in Paris. So I brought the letter back to my superiors and said, oh, I know where I have to go. Merton says, go to Paris. Oh, no, they said, we can't send you to Paris. We never sent anyone to France who came home again. And I said, but Merton says, no, we can't send you. So there was a standoff for 3 months. I was hitting him over the head with Merton's letter. And finally they relented. And I got to Paris. And it's there that I met my mentor, Père Chenu, C-H-E-N-U, a wonderful 75-year-old Dominican and a great historian who was very important in the Second Vatican Council, which had just ended about a year before I showed up in France. And he's the one who named the creation spiritual tradition for me. So I'll always be grateful to Thomas Merton. And of course, he's the one who got me into all my trouble. If I hadn't gone to Paris, I doubt that I would have heard about creation spirituality, which is what I've been about since returning. So here's a few sentences from his letter. I'm glad you're going to work on spiritual theology. I do think we are lying down on the job when we leave others to investigate mysticism while we concentrate on more practical things. What people want of us, after all, is the way to God. So that's why I call the book A Way to God, Thomas Merton's Creation Spirituality Journal. Now, Merton's story is interesting. His mother was American. His father was New Zealander and was an artist. They were both artists. And they met in Paris, actually, at the Art Institute there, the School of Art, and fell in love. And then they moved to a small town in southern France where Merton was born. But his mother died when he was only 6 or so. And his father died when he was like 14 or 15. And he ended up in England with an uncle, I believe it was, and attended school there and lived quite a libertine life as a young man in college in England. Then he went to America and went to Columbia University and still lived a libertine life and got his master's degree in English literature. He loved to write and he got very good training there. I actually met a woman, she was on my board once, who dated Thomas Merton in the late 1930s at Columbia. I said, what was he like? She paused and she said, he was a lot of fun. He loved to laugh. He could talk about anything. He was so well-read and interested in everything. And he could really dance, she said. But he did drink a lot. Well, Merton had his, what can I say, his rambunctious days in his 20s. And then he visited Cuba, and there he had a spiritual awakening at the shrine of the Black Madonna in Cuba, which is dedicated to the slaves of the Caribbean. And it's still a very powerful shrine. It's still going in Cuba. But so he became a Christian almost, quite suddenly. and then returned. And people were very surprised because they all knew him as this fun-loving young man. And he tried to join the Franciscans, and they wouldn't accept him. So then he thought about the Trappists, and they did accept him. And so in 1940, December 10th, I think it was 1940, he joined the Trappist order in Louisville. And after the war, 1948, he was ordained a priest. And it's interesting and very telling that he dedicated his first mass as a priest to the Black Madonna. So I think it's very significant that the Black Madonna played so important a role in his early Christian life. And he wrote in 1948, I think, his autobiography, Seven Story Mountain, which was extremely well timed, very synchronistic, because the war was over and a lot of men who came back from the war were drawn to a contemplative life. You know, it's after what you see in war, you can see why many men would be drawn to that. And he writes very, very well. And his story was powerful and convincing and beautiful. And so a lot of monastic communities like his swelled in numbers after his book came out, because the book became very well read. It sold over 1 million copies in just a short time. And it was translated into many, many languages. So he became famous almost overnight, kind of like Hildegard of Bingen when she wrote her first book. And then wrote a lot of books after that. But in 1958, a very important thing happened to Thomas Merton. It was a conversion experience. He had been a monk for 18 years in a strict monastery. And he met Dr. Suzuki, the Zen Buddhist who brought Zen from Japan to North America. He read him and he met him. And Suzuki said, "You should read the one Zen thinker of the West, Meister Eckhart." And Merton said, "Well, Eckhart's been condemned by the church." And Suzuki said, "Well, I can't help that, can I?" So Merton thought it over. In 1958, he did two things. He read Eckhart and he read Zen poetry. And he totally flipped from being an Augustinian, fall redemption, sort of guilt-ridden Christian monk of the 40s and 50s to being a prophetic Christian for the next 10 years of his life, from 1958 to 1968. He'd written a lot about contemplation and the interior life and all that, but he shifted and started writing about other religions, Sufism, Buddhism, Native American, indigenous. My Name is Ishi was his book that came out after the story of Ishi came out in the early 60s. And Ishi, as you may know, was part of a California tribe. And in California in the late 19th century, Indians had a $50 bounty on their heads. Kill an Indian, make $50. And his small tribe fled, of course, and hid for years. But they died out. And this one man was the last one left. His name was Ishi. And he came out of hiding in, I think it was 1906, if I'm not mistaken, the date's in my book, and kind of surrendered to the white world. And there was an anthropology professor at University of Berkeley, of California in Berkeley, who took him in to his home. And he lived for 6 more years. And his son wrote the book on on Ishi. And then Thomas Merton picked it up and he wrote a book called My Name is Ishi to identify with the suffering of the Native people in America. And the first sentence contains the word genocide. And I think it's the first time that word has ever been used. And Merton has a lot to say about the treatment of the Native Americans. And of course, he wrote a lot about war and peace in the 60s, and especially regarding the Vietnam War. He coached the Berrigan brothers. They would come and sit with him at the Hermitage, and he coached them on nonviolence and so forth. So he was their mentor. which put him on the map, of course, for the CIA and FBI, who did not appreciate the Dan Berrigan types who were outspoken about the immorality of the Vietnam War. And but he also was involved in environmentalism. Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring, which most people agree was a springboard for the whole environmental movement. And when it came out, she was vilified by scientists and academics. In fact, she lost her job in academia. They said, this is a hysterical woman and she's out of her mind and blah, blah, blah. Merton, on the contrary, as soon as he read it, he wrote her a 3 or 4 page letter praising her for the book and telling her it explained to him what had happened in the monastery farm for years. They were losing the birds and so forth. And of course, the insects were disappearing. So he said, from now on, we are quitting overnight our use of DDT, which was a big part of her book. So he was right on the spot. And also he was on the spot for the feminist movement. He started a correspondence with Rosemary Ruther, the Catholic feminist who was only 27 or 28 at the time, was teaching at Howard University in Washington, DC. And they had this correspondence that was very tough. By tough, I mean, she was tough on him. She was half his age. He was 53 at the time, I think, or 52. And you can get their correspondence. Of course, I would have some of it here. Rosemary just died, by the way, a few weeks ago. So he was out front on the ecology movement, out front on ecumenism, out front on war and peace, out front on feminism. And he died in 1968. And I believe, and there is a whole book out on this called The Death of Thomas Merton. I believe he was martyred. I believe he was martyred by our government. The CIA did him in. The rumor that they started after he died made no sense whatsoever to me. Now there's a film done of him. He gave his last talk at this retreat center in Bangkok. And it was to monks, Christian monks of the East. The Dutch filmed it. And he was very vigorous at the time and so forth. And 2 or 3 hours after his talk, he was dead. And you can read the book if you want to know more, called The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton. I have it right here. Yeah. And but even before that book came out, I felt that he had died, because they spread this rumor that he had come out of a shower wet and plugged a fan in, and it killed him. Well, first of all, everyone had the fans on at that place. It was hot in Thailand and in the winter, well, our winter, their summer. And obviously others had used that fan, didn't die from it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of evidence. I've even seen the photographs, which the monastery has not allowed anyone to see, so it's not in the book, but the authors of the book of martyrdom sent it to me, so I've seen it. And he's lying there on his back with just shorts on and briefs on, and there's actually blood coming out from the back of his neck. So electrocution does not make blood come out from the back of your neck. But I don't want to get into that. We have to get moving here. So let me get into some of his teachings, which are so wonderful because he writes so well. That's one reason they're wonderful. He writes so well. But secondly, they're wonderful because he's deep. He's done his inner work. And so he has something to say about the inner life, but also about the prophetic life. Now, let me say a little more about him and Eckhart. In his Asian diary, Asian journal, his last book, which he wrote on his trip east, which was a, forget now, a two-month trip or something like that. He wrote in the margins of his journal, Eckhart is my lifeboat. Eckhart is my lifeboat. That is how important Eckhart became to Merton. And you can't understand Merton. You cannot understand him if you don't know Eckhart. His second to last book, Zen and the Bird of Appetites, is all about Eckhart and Suzuki. And Suzuki's book on mysticism, East and West, the whole first chapter is on Eckhart. And Merton even made a trip from the monastery to New York to meet in person with Suzuki when Suzuki was like 94, 95 years old. And it was a beautiful encounter. And of course, they talked about Eckhart. So and this is why I insisted when the center, Thomas Merton Center, asked me to talk on the centennial of Merton about Merton and me. I insisted, no, Merton, Eckhart and me, because Eckhart has been very important to me and absolutely converted Thomas Merton. So what I do here, since this is about Merton's creation spiritual journey, among other things, is to walk through the 4 paths of creation spirituality. So let's take a look at some teachings from Merton about the via positiva. He says, quote, "Contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is that life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive. It is a spiritual wonder. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being." That's as wonderful a statement on the via positiva as you're ever going to read. I mean, it's right there, and that's his definition of contemplation. He says, our real journey in life is interior. It is a matter of growth, deepening, and of ever greater surrender to the creative action of love and grace in our hearts. Never was it more necessary for us to respond to that action. He says, my worship is a blue sky and 10,000 crickets in the deep, wet hay of the field. My vow is a silence under their song. I admire the woodpecker and the dove in simple mathematics of flights. Together we study practical norms. The plowed and planted field is red as a brick in the sun and says, now my turn. Several of us begin to sing. He says, no blade of grass is not blessed. On this archetypal cosmic hill, this womb of mysteries, I must not omit to mention a rabbit and 2 birds bathing in the stream. He was very observant, like Mary Oliver is, very much busy paying attention. And that is the contemplative modality, to focus, to see deeply, to listen deeply. He writes, every plant that stands in the light of the sun is a saint and an outlaw. I love that. A saint and an outlaw. You can be both. That should be good news for many of us. Every plant that stands in the light of the sun is a saint and an outlaw. Every tree that brings forth blossoms without the command of man is powerful in the sight of God. Every star that man has not counted is a world of sanity and perfection. Every blade of grass is an angel singing in a shower of glory. These are worlds of themselves. No man can use or destroy them. You can see the poet in this man. And of course, he wrote a lot of poetry. In fact, the collection of his poetry is that thick. It's thicker than Tolstoy's War and Peace. In his journal, he wrote, dance in the sun, you tepid idiot. Wake up and dance in the clarity of perfect contradiction. You fool, it is life that makes you dance. have you forgotten? So he's talking to himself. He's criticizing himself. One person has counted 1,800 references to nature in Merton's journals alone. 1,800 references to nature. So that's creation spirituality, folks. And of course, he was Celtic. His parents were Welsh, of Welsh ancestry. And he talks about that. He says, I celebrated gratefully the Celtic spirit that coursed through my Welsh blood. And now, when he moved to the woods, he wrote this beautiful passage, which is about the night, the beauty of the night, the sacredness of the night. Here it goes. I love this passage. It's actually also the Via Negativa, because now he's talking about the night and about silence in a special way. He writes, and he's kind of defending himself for living in a hermitage. I live in the woods out of necessity. I get out of bed in the middle of the night because it is imperative that I hear the silence of the night alone and with my face on the floor, say psalms alone in the silence of the night. The silence of the forest is my bride, and the sweet, dark warmth of the whole world is my love. And out of the heart of that dark warmth comes a secret that is heard only in silence. But it is the root of all the secrets that are whispered by all the lovers in their beds all over the world. A beautiful passage worthy of the Song of Songs, where he's relating human love to divine love in the silence of the night. Now, we had a very important mystical experience one day at noon, rush hour, in Louisville. He was there to see a doctor or something. And he was crossing the street called Walnut Street, a busy street, and people were out getting lunch. And he experienced light in everybody, in every person that he saw, all these strangers. And he wrote about it the next day, and he said, in his journal, he said, how is it possible to tell people they're all walking around shining like the sun, S-U-N? And of course, that was a mystical experience, but it was a cosmic Christ experience. He saw the light of the Christ in every being, in all these strangers. And that is how you tell people that they're shining like the sun. You remind them of the cosmic Christ. And he wrote in his journal also, thank God, I'm only another member of the human race like all the rest of them. I have the immense joy of being a man, as if the sorrows of our condition could really matter. Once we begin to realize who and what we are, as if we could ever begin to realize it on earth. He talks about becoming who we truly are. Now, the Via Negativa also is about silence. I love this poem of his. Be still. Listen to the stones of the wall. Be silent. They cry to speak your name. They try to speak your name. Excuse me. Be silent. They try to speak your name. Listen to the living walls. Who are you? Whose silence are you? And here's another poem on silence. The whole world is secretly on fire. The stones burn, even the stones. They burn me. How can a person be still or listen to all things burning? How can one dare to sit with them when all their silence is on fire? And he often talks about the barrel mind, about emptying the mind. And there's this one phrase he created. He says, love winter when the plant says nothing. Love winter when the plant says nothing. And so contemplation in the via negativa, it can be described as winter, when the plants shut down, so to speak, and are much quieter. They're not blooming anymore. They're resting. Love winter when the plant says, the deepest level of communication, he says, is not communication, but communion. It is wordless. Wordless. It is beyond words, and it is beyond speech, and it is beyond concept. The woods of nature should be part of your solitude. He talks about he read a lot, and he read plays and poetry. So he talks about the play by Ionesco called Rhinoceros. And he says, Ionesco comes very close to Zen and to Christian Hermetism. Modern man is the man in a rush, therefore the rhinoceros. Man who has no time, who is a prisoner of necessity, who cannot understand that a thing might perhaps be without usefulness. If one does not understand the usefulness of the useless and the uselessness of the useful, one cannot understand art. And a country whose art is not understood is a country of slaves and robots. And of course, remember that Merton grew up in France with two artistic parents. So he was very attuned to the art world. And as we'll see, he was a musician, he was a painter. He took up calligraphy, which is one reason it's in this painting that I just showed you. You can see it, it's down at its feet. And it's interesting too, that the artist here has a stylus in one hand and a hoe in another with Merton, because the Trappists work the fields. He says, the rhinoceritis, the disease of rhinoceritis, that is, say, running around all the time, is the sickness that lies in wait for those who have lost the sense and the taste for solitude. Lost the sense and the taste for solitude. And of course, he also talks about man's enormous want and of suffering and grief. And here's a short poem. Fire, turn inward to your weak fort, to a burly infant spot, a house of nothing, a house of nothing. O peace, bless this mad place. Silence, love this growth. O silence, golden zero. Unsetting sun, love winter when the plant says nothing. Golden zero. That's a beautiful phrase. And when I shared that with a group several years ago, a young man just ran with it. It just said everything to him. That nothingness and zero can be golden. It contains doxa and glory, as does the rest of life, as does the beauty in life. You have to understand that all along now, in his maturity, from 1958 to 1968, he was reading Eckhart, and he brings Eckhart in all the time in his writings. And of course, Eckhart talks about all of these things, about nothingness, about being unborn, the unborn self, to give attention to your unborn self and become your unborn self, and about being emptied. So Merton wrote in his journal, I am the utter poverty of God. I am his emptiness, littleness, nothingness, lostness. When this is understood, my life and his freedom, the self-emptying of God in me, is the fullness of grace. And Merton is absolutely plagiarizing Eckhart in this next teaching. Eckhart says, when you've learned to let go and let be, you're always in the right place at the right time, whether you're alone in your cell or in a marketplace. You're always in the right place at the right time. Well, here's Merton. As soon as a man is fully disposed to be alone with God, he is alone with God no matter where he may be, in the country, the monastery, the woods, or the city. The lightning flashes from east to west, illuminating the whole horizon and striking where it pleases. And at the same instant, the infinite liberty of God flashes in the depths of man's soul, and he is illuminated. So it's straight plagiarism from Eckhart, which is fine. Okay, now the Via Creativa. I have a nice picture of Merton with his camera. Merton picked up the camera when he was in the monastery and had a very good training from a good friend of his who was a professional photographer. And so Merton took up photography and he loved it. But the pictures he took were of broken things. He didn't take a lot of pictures of beautiful flowers or anything like that. He took pictures of broken things. And I remember when I visited his museum there at the center, Thomas Merton Center, I fell in love with this one picture and I got their permission to reproduce it. I have it in my conclusion chapter, which is called A Way to God in the Perfect Circle of Merton's Spiritual Journey. And this is the picture that he took. It's big. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, hanging in the museum. But I think you can see it. It's an old wheel, Maybe it traveled over Iowa. It certainly was a wheel that has seen a lot of life. It's beaten up, it's broken, but it's a circle and it's still a wheel. And it really caught my attention. And they had a number of his photographs there, but that's the one that really caught me. So I was so pleased to be able to include it in my book. But to meditate on these broken things is what he most preferred. And this is a picture of him with his camera in his hands and smiling and happy, because that was just one of the artist meditation practices that he developed. Of course, he was a writer, yes. He was a poet also, yes. As I say, he did calligraphy, so he's a painter. He also played the piano, and he loved jazz. He loved jazz. In fact, he would sneak out, make up an excuse to get out of the monastery, like he had a stomach ache or something. He'd go see the doctor in Louisville. And what he would do in Louisville was go to these black clubs, jazz clubs. And he was the only white guy there. I heard this from an 80-something black man who was a young man. And this was 15 years ago or so when I was writing the book. But he was a young man at that time. And he said there's a strange white guy who would show up and sit in the back, the only white guy in the place. But he obviously loved jazz. And when we talked to him, all he wanted to talk about was jazz and Zen. Jazz and Zen. Well, that was Thomas Merton, the monk, disguised. I mean, he wasn't, of course, wearing his monkish outfit. But I think it tells a lot that he was so, and of course, the French are absolutely in love with jazz. I mean, a lot of jazz musicians, as you know, in the 30s and 40s and 20s, escaped American racism and went to Paris. And so jazz is really big. I mean, the French are crazy about jazz. And so that's part of his French blood, if you will, even though he did not have French blood, his parents weren't French, but the cultural atmosphere of Paris was very, very partial to jazz. Just like Baldwin escaped American racism to live in Paris for many years. Here's Merton, Via Creativa. There is something in my nature that gets the keenest and sharpest pleasure out of achievement, out of work finished and printed and distributed and read. So, because primarily he was a writer. And as he said, it was something in his nature. And but I'm trying to emphasize how important artist meditation was for him. Another proof of it is this. He was a novice master. So for young people coming in, for example, he was a novice master to the wonderful poet from Nicaragua, who only stayed a couple years in the monastery and then went back to Nicaragua. And I'm talking about, now his name's escaped me. Who am I talking about? He wrote, hold on. Oh, shame on me. Oh, what's his name? Oh, there it is. Yeah, Ernesto Cardenal. Ernesto Cardenal, who's I've had the privilege to meet on several occasions. The year I was silenced by the Vatican, I went to Nicaragua and spent time with Ernesto Cardenal and others. But Ernesto Cardenal wrote this wonderful book, Cosmic Canticle, which is the new creation story from science, one long epic poem, wonderful book. But he was a novice under Thomas Merton at Gethsemane. Then he went back and he joined the Nicaraguan Revolution and so forth. But with the novices, Merton taught the novices to weave baskets. Well, he brought a specialist in to teach them, if you will. But the point is that he realized that artist meditation is an important part of deepening your spirituality. And remember that artist meditation, according to the psychologists Naranjo and Ornstein, is the way of the prophets, the way of the prophets. Remember, from the prophets of Israel, we have great poetry, and many of them were vine dressers. And of course, Jesus was a carpenter as well as a peasant farmer. So artist meditation is the way of the prophets. And just sitting meditation does not always lead to the prophetic engagement. So Merton had a lot to say about creativity, of course. And this is, like Eckhart, he attributes it to the Holy Spirit. And he says the theology of the Holy Spirit is necessary for us today. And the pathway to that is creativity. Now, Aquinas had it too before Eckhart. Aquinas says the same spirit that hovers over the waters at the beginning of creation hovers over the mind of the artist at work. Same spirit. That's what co-creation means. We create with the Holy Spirit. And that was Merton's teaching, and it was Eckhart. Eckhart talks about the angel appearing to Mary. The Holy Spirit shall come upon thee. And Eckhart says that means the work is with, outside, and above the artist must become the work that is in the artist. The Holy Spirit shall come upon thee, that is, the above may become in. So here too, Eckhart and Merton are on the same page. And he says the camera in my hands has become an instrument of contemplation, an instrument of contemplation. Photography is a way of framing wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, so that suchness reveals itself, suchness. Suzuki says, in Christian terms, suchness is to see God in an angel, as angel, to see God in a flea, as flea. A friend commented about Merton. He was not a photographer. For him, the camera was merely another tool for dealing with things everybody knows about, but isn't attending to. Attending to. It's a way to attend. It's a way to focus, literally, and pay attention, as Mary Oliver says. You know. So here's a beautiful poem by Merton that I just love. It's one of my favorites. Short. When psalms surprise me with their music, and of course the monks sing the psalms all day long and in the middle of the night, and antiphons turn to rum. Now an antiphon is a little prayer that's thrown in the middle of singing of psalms, but I love that line. When psalms surprise me with their music and antiphons turn to rum, the spirit sings, the bottom drops out of my soul. And from the center of my cellar, love, louder than thunder, opens a heave of naked air. I just love that poem. That is such a statement on what prayer is. on what prayer is. It's got rum in it. Sign me up. And it's a dropping out of your soul. You're in the cellar. Notice below, this is feminism coming from below. And a heave of naked air. And of course, air and spirit are the same words. Merton said, quote, poetry is not ordinary speech, nor is poetic experience ordinary experience. It is closer to religious experience. Contemplative peace. He loved Blake. And in fact, I think he did a master's thesis on William Blake. He also had a genius for friendship, according to his closest friends, a genius for friendship. And it is true, the people who, his correspondence, he wrote to so many people all around the world. And among his close friends were Dorothy Day, James Forrest, Dan and Philip Berrigan, Gordon Zahn, writers like Lawrence Fergaletti, Wendell Berry, who visited him in his hermitage, Boris Pasternak. These were correspondence with him. Zaslow Milotz, Bill Everson, brother Antonius, Henry Miller, the psychologist, Eric Fromm, Carl Stern, scientists, and others. But as John Howard Griffin put it, he had a genius for friendship. So that's another art form that he developed. So now let's move to the Via Transformativa. He uses the phrase, a prophetic struggle with the world. He says, in the conflict between law and freedom, God is on the side of freedom. That is a scandalous statement, but it is the New Testament. How are we going to affirm to the modern world the scandal of the New Testament? It is here that we confront the seriousness of our prophetic as distinct from our contemplative calling. Now, I just love that because for my first book, on Becoming a Musical Mystical Bear, I have contrasted and put into a dialectical relationship the mystical and the prophetic, or if you will, the contemplative and the prophetic. That's exactly what Merton does here explicitly. We confront the seriousness of our prophetic as distinct from our contemplative calling. So contemplation is a vocation and a calling, but so too is the prophetic. And that's the Via Transformativa. And of course, it's fed by the Via Creativa. We just said, art is meditation, is the way of the prophets. And I look on social artists like Dr. King or Gandhi. They lasso the anger of the people and they steer it into nonviolent, effective action. So it is a work of art to turn frustration and anger and moral outrage into something useful. So it doesn't just splatter all over the wall and get people even more abused in the process. Walter Brueggemann, the great biblical scholar, wrote a fine book, The Prophetic Imagination. He says, every totalitarian regime is afraid of the artist. It's a vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination. And certainly Merton is in good company there. But I want to share with you a few of his prophetic positions. I've already talked about some. We don't have a lot of time left. I don't even get your questions. But we talked about feminism. We talked about deep ecumenism and so forth. But and racism, he's very explicit about that. And remember, he's living in the South in the 50s and during the civil rights movement. So he made a number of enemies by speaking out bluntly about that. And remember, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, King quotes Thomas Aquinas about not obeying bad laws, about human law versus divine law. He says, mass media is presently being consciously employed to hide the lot of the nation's victims behind a glittering Niagara of trivia. A glittering Niagara of trivia. Now that was written in the 60s. I don't think there's been less trivia or less glitter or less of a Niagara since Merton's time. I think he was named something very important, the power of the media to distract and to get us all worked up about trivia and not about, well, justice. He had amazing encounters with young people, you know, anti-war activists of the late 60s. And of course, I was one of those, that's my generation, where they asked him to talk about the monastic life. And they said, well, we're monks too. You know, you talk about peacemaking, inner peace, we want that too. So there are these marvelous dialogues. One was at the University of Santa Barbara, which he visited. And he was very in tune with, and he said, yeah, he said, I think a hippie is a lot like a monk. We both step out of the dominant culture and propose other values. So I want to share one thing, and that is he was one of the unusual people who was not real enthusiastic about the moonshot. So if you recall, those of us who were there, the late 60s there was a lot of hoopla about getting to the moon. And why wouldn't there be? I mean, it was pretty special. But Merton put up a certain caution sign, a yellow light. And this is what he wrote. And it's very prophetic. Remember, the prophet interferes. He says, even if humans can fly, so what? There are flying ants. Even if humans fly all over the universe, we are still nothing but a flying ant until we recover a human center and a human spirit in the depth of our own being. What can we gain by sailing to the moon? Someone should write this to Elon Musk. What can we gain by sailing to the moon if we are not able to cross the abyss that separates us from ourselves? This is the most important of all voyages of discovery, and without it, all the rest are not only useless, but disastrous. Powerful, powerful. Yes, we've got
Matthew, you're muted.
Did I go mute?
Yes, just for 10 seconds.
We've gotten to the moon. We're present on Mars and so forth. Wonderful things. But what progress have we made regarding our relations with ourselves? We got another Second World War going on in Ukraine 80 years after. So what he's calling for here is pretty darn prophetic. It's pretty important. Again, the most important of all voyages isn't the outer voyage, it's the inner voyage. That's what he's inviting us to. And he's not just saying it, he's screaming it. Now, I want to end with one more poem by him. And it's a marvelous poem, and it's him through and through. It's called First Lesson About Man, meaning human beings. Man begins in zoology. And of course, that's his recognition of evolution, and we are the offspring of apes. He is a sadist animal. He drives a big red car called anxiety. Whenever he goes to the phone to call joy, he gets the wrong number. Therefore, he likes weapons. He knows all guns by their right names. He drives a big black Cadillac called death. Now he's putting anxiety into space. He flies his worries all around Venus, but it does him no good. Man is the saddest animal. He begins in zoology and gets lost in his own bad news. I have goosebumps. Isn't that perfect for our moment in history for 2022? So that's a short summary of Thomas Merton. Don't underestimate him, and I look forward to our sharing. In your questions. So I think Dennis could handle them. We have.
Thank you, Matthew.
Okay.
That was a wonderful talk. Talk about profession. It truly was.
Pardon me?
Invite you now to ask questions. Go down to your reactions button at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand, and Dennis will call on you.
I love Thomas Merton.
Mary Beth?
And I read his Seven-Story Mountain when I was a teenager, and it certainly had an impact on me. It had something to do with my own calling. So what do people do? They raise their hand? Is that, or how do they do that? Do you all know how to do that?
Yeah, they should go down to the reactions button, and I thought I saw
Mary Lynn.
Marilyn Crocker. Yes.
Mary Lynn.
I don't hear you.
Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Yeah, I wondered, I hear echoes in what you say of Father Thomas Keating and Richard Rohr. I wonder if you might comment on that.
Sure. Well, of course, Father Thomas Keating belonged to the same religious order, the Trappists, though his monastery was in Colorado and Merton's was in Kentucky. And there's one in Iowa, outside Dubuque, Iowa as well. And I frequently visited there when I was doing my studies in Iowa. So, so they have that very much in common. Furthermore, of course, Merton was older than Keating, so Keating read Merton, I'm sure, of course. And I'm sure he was nurtured by Thomas Merton. So there is that link. And of course, I'm sure that Richard Rohr has read Thomas Merton. And one of the people who works with Richard Rohr knows Thomas Merton's work quite well. In fact, I'm not real sure. Now, of course, I forget his name, but and I'm not really sure if he may have been a Trappist monk at some time. But anyway, he's kind of a scholar. I forget his name. It's a short name like Forbes or something like that. One word, I think, is an F. But he's written about Merton and knows him. So certainly he's interacted with Richard Rohr too. But actually, you know, Roman Catholics of my generation and Richard Rohr are the same generation. Merton was important to us when we were young. And so he impacted lots of people. You have to realize millions of people read his books. He was very popular. And he was very out there. Not that he left his monastery much at all. His going to New York to visit with Suzuki was special permission from his abbot. But he did a lot of conferences and tapes, audio tapes and so forth, and interacted with a lot of sisters communities and retreats and so forth. People would come to the monastery, but occasionally he would go to some centers, especially around where the monastery was in Kentucky there. But so that it's no surprise that Richard Rohr, a Franciscan, and Keating, a Trappist, and myself, a Dominican, would have interacted in terms of reading Thomas Merton and knowing him. I spent a summer in a hermitage when I was a young Dominican. Before I interacted with Merton, it was on Vancouver Island, and there was a Belgian abbot who ran the hermitage. And I told Merton that in my initial letter to Merton, and he knew this abbot. This particular abbot also was a biblical scholar. So there was that link too. And just before he died, before he left for Asia, Merton did me a big favor. He packed up a bunch of documents he had about this high, about almost 10 inches or a foot high. And he packed them up and sent them to me and said, someday these may be of interest to you. And there are a number of unpublished articles and also his notes from teaching novices and the history of spirituality and so forth. So he left me those things just a couple of months before he died.
Damien, you want to go ahead?
Unmute. Hi, Matthew. Good to see you again. And thanks again, like to thank you for your beautiful work on creation spirituality and your daily meditations, which I follow daily.
Oh, yes, I recognize your name. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. My question that popped into my mind is, I'm sure you've read Teilhard de Chardin, another mystic in the Christian spirituality tradition, and he was a Catholic priest, as you know, and he wrote several works, and his works were blacklisted by the church. You know, he was too progressive for the church.
Good way to put it.
But he combined spirituality and science because he was like a mystic and a scientist. So he's written several works, and I'm sure you've read them. I don't know if you've written any books on Teilhard de Chardin, or it's in there in your daily meditations or not. But the question I have is that he's known for a famous, besides all his books and ideas, which are very progressive and spiritual, he's quoted a lot for saying something like that when man discovers divine love, he will have discovered fire again. You know, in other words, it'll be transformative, not only personally, but socially. It's like very few people know divine love the way he was describing it in that statement. And the question I have is, on our personal journey of spiritual transformation, like you say, the inner journey, which is so important, that the mystics have undertaken, and there are many good examples like yourself of the mystics and the prophets. Do you feel like growing in that divine love is one of the fruits of the spiritual journey that Teilhard de Chardin spoke so highly of? And I'm sure he experienced it also, that it's so transformative for us as individuals and as society, that'll be like discovering fire again for mankind. Are you familiar with that quote?
I am indeed. So I have a section on Teilhard in my book on the Christian mystics. I think I give him about 10 pages or so. So that's one place where I bring him in. But of course, he was very influential on Thomas Berry. Berry was head of the Teilhard Society in New York for 10 or 12 years. And Thomas Berry kind of stands on the shoulders of Teilhard de Chardin, and he says it, but also of Thomas Aquinas, because after whom Thomas Berry is named. And I heard Berry speak probably 25 times. He never once spoke without quoting Thomas Aquinas. So, but remember that Teilhard was also very famous for bringing back the concept of the cosmic Christ.
Yes.
And that in like 1913, I think it was, and the Christ cosmique. And it's so important because most Christians, when they think of Christology or Christ, they think of the Nicene Creed, which was in the 4th century, and the council was called by the emperor. But the cosmic Christ is in the first writings of the Christian Bible. It's in Paul, and also in the Gospel of Thomas, which is very early. So it's a scandal, and it's part of modern consciousness that the cosmic Christ was lost in the modern era. And we just stuck with the Nicene Creed and these Greek philosophical categories of substance and so forth. So Teilhard did a very important thing in bringing the cosmic Christ alive again. And Merton was very much into the cosmic Christ, and they both had the same complaint. Teilhard complained that he couldn't find anyone, layperson or theologian, who wanted to talk about the cosmic Christ. And Teilhard de Chardin had these soirees in Paris after he returned from China and all that, and where he would share his ideas, and very often he'd have like 5 or 6 people would show up, 5 or 6 people. And at his funeral, I think there were only 10 people or something like that in upstate New York.
Yeah.
But here's Merton he says this on the cosmic Christ. He says, I am astounded that these teachings on the cosmic Christ receive so little attention from Christians today. And I have a whole section here on Merton on the cosmic Christ. He says, every non-two-legged creature is a saint, And he says, every creature is giving off light. And remember the experience he had in downtown Louisville with humans. But it's not just humans who are giving off light, every creature is giving off light. And of course, today's science says that too, that trees and so forth are literally giving off light and color on a regular basis. So, and it's interesting, in the last talk Merton gave 3 hours before he died, he cited like 15 different writers. Let me just share this with you because it gives you a sense of his mind, where he's at. Ruth Benedict, Anais Nin, Denis Levertov, William Blake, Dom Jean Leclerc, a French Benedictine monk, Herbert Macusa, a Marxist, Roger Garaudy, a Marxist at the time, St. Teresa of Avila, Ludwig Feuerbach, Teilhard de Chardin, that's why I got to this, Teilhard de Chardin, Carl Jung, St. Bernard, St. Augustine, Karl Marx, Erich Fromm, St. Paul, the Dalai Lama, St. Benedict, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, John Cashin, Sartre, Karl Jaspers, Rilke, Jacques Maritain, who met him. Jacques Maritain, as an old man, came to the monastery all the way from France to spend time alone with Thomas Merton. So you get a sense of how well read he was, and in so many fields that he was interested in. But Teilhard is right there. He quoted Teilhard his last hours on earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Teilhard.
So the cosmic Christ consciousness, I'm sure it includes the light, of divine love. And so I'm sure that's what he meant when he says that mankind will have discovered fire for the second time, is that divine love is synonymous with the light of Christ's cosmic consciousness. Wouldn't you agree? It's a mystery,
Yes.
but
That we have breakthroughs of. We have breakthroughs of it in our mystical experiences, like Merton on the street in Louisville, and in many other circumstances, reading and praying and worship and all that. Yeah. It's
another word for unconditional love, right? So that divine love.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Grace in action. Yes.
Grace in action. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for your beautiful work.
Robert, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Also, I behind me have a lawyer's bookshelf of all Merton. As many people listening, I'm sure, have whole shelves and so forth. I often feel like I and so many others are approaching Merton like the story of all the folks trying to figure out what an elephant is by touching one part of it, the trunk or the tail or a leg or something. And I just really found your 4 paths of creation spirituality to be very helpful as a lens, in a sense, to look at Merton. And as you were talking, I was just furiously writing the various other resources that fit into each of those categories. So I want to thank you for that. And I hope to be able to get your book and see how that works out more fully.
Well, thank you, Robert. I'm glad that you saw that, the value of that application, because like you say, Merton was extremely voluminous. You know, he wrote so many books.
Absolutely.
They cover so many fields. But I do think that the 4 paths, you know, give them an organizing principle, if you will.
Yeah.
And they also allow him to speak, I think, most richly, because he can, you know, jump from one theme to another and also repeat themes. Not that he repeats himself, but, you know, he grows and he changes and all this. So I just think it is a marvelous methodology, a device to assist us to understand him and understand him in depth. You know, one of my students got a master's degree with us and went on and got a doctorate in English literature, I think the University of Kansas. And he did his doctorate on Walt Whitman. And he got a summa cum laude, and the board that approved of his doctoral thesis, because he took the 4 paths and applied them to Walt Whitman.
Wow.
And the board went berserk with joy, because they said this is a first interpretation that covers all of Whitman. You know, some people say he's Buddhist or he's this or he's that, but this was inclusive, and it brought Whitman out at his best. You know, he's dealing with all of those 4 paths. And I think we all deal with them in our life. That's why, for me, they are so valuable as understanding our spiritual path. And they take us far beyond illumination, purgation, illumination, and union, which was a more classical naming of the journey. And I got the 4 paths from Meister Eckhart. They're all there. They're embedded there. They're not, you know, they're not named as via positiva and via negativa and via creativa and via transformativa, but they're all cooking in Eckhart. And the first I ever wrote about the 4 paths was an article on Meister Eckhart and the 4 paths in my book, Western Spirituality. And they've never failed me. And of course, I've been teaching them for 45 years or more. And I've seen so much, what can I say, life come out of people who do apply them to whatever. You can apply them to so many elements and to so many writers. And yeah, so I was very pleased with, because working on Merton is, I mean, he's volumes and volumes. And how do you organize it? And how do you, and how do you focus in and keep it short, more or less short, without losing the depth that's there? And again, I think the 4 paths really assist us in that. Yeah.
Well, as someone calling from Wichita, Kansas, I appreciate the allusion
wow.
to KU. And the other bookshelf behind me is Whitman. So
you're kidding. Oh my God, this is
synchronicity today.
This is crazy. I believe in synchronicity.
You bet. Thank you so much.
That's great.
Ellen, go ahead.
First, I want to just applaud this collaboration with these 3 retreat centers. You know, what a fabulous idea. And that to invite Matthew to monthly, you know, focus on a book, and you all have, you know, can go back and discuss it yourselves. And for me personally, it's given me the opportunity to revisit some of these books. And Matthew, of all your books, I have to say this is one of my favorites. Because of the intimate view both of Thomas Merton and the access you had to things that were never published before. You know, the incredible research that went into this and your personal experience of it, but also how Merton's life and your life parallel each other. And I found that fascinating. I read the book in 4 days. I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. But I also was hoping you would talk a little bit about his encounters with Joan Baez, because I found that fascinating.
Joan Baez would come out and picnic with him. And she reports the first thing he said was, "Will you get me a hamburger?" Now you have to understand, Trappists are vegetarian, so that was. And also he would drink beer, and he got a little tipsy. So that's what she reports on, But again, Joan Baez was a hero for me in the 60s. I just loved her music. And of course, she was part of the movement. And but it is interesting that he attracted singers and poets and philosophers and scientists and activists and all that. But yeah, that's a good story. They would picnic and he would break his vegetarian vow and would drink too much beer. So
And I
that's
think you mentioned that he wrote a song. They collaborated with the song, like he wrote a song for her.
okay. I didn't realize that. What song is that?
It's in your book. Read it.
Well, okay. Let me look. It has a good index. Let me look Baez because I think I talk a
Pretty
lot.
sure that's where I read it. Yeah.
I don't remember that they wrote a song together. Wow.
Yeah, he wrote a song for her or something. Maybe I found that after.
There it is. Okay. Well,
It's
she's
a
in there a
good-
couple of times.
Yeah.
One thing I want to point out, when I went to his center to do research, I looked up some of his classes that he was teaching the novices and some of the other monks too about the history of spirituality before 1958. And in 1956, or maybe even 1957, he was going through the history of Western spirituality. When he came to Eckhart, all he said was, he's dangerous. He was condemned by the church. So watch out. And then he moved on. He didn't have anything more to say. So I just think that's so important because the next year he utterly flipped because of Eckhart. But it took an Easterner, it took a Buddhist to tell him to read Eckhart. He did not get it from the West. And of course, that's the story with Eckhart. He was condemned a week after he died by a very, very corrupt Pope. I don't know if he was as corrupt as Pope John Paul II, but he may have been, and Pope Benedict, but they give him a run for his money. Pope John the 22nd, who condemned the Beguines, the women's movement of the Middle Ages, 17 different times, which suggests that it wasn't working, this condemnation. Out damn spot. He's the guy who also condemned Eckhart. And of course, Eckhart worked with the Beguines. So that also made Eckhart suspect. But anyway, well, I don't know if it's worth it to look up Baez to find out what song they did together, but if you want me to spend the time doing that.
No, it wasn't as he wrote it, but it isn't, we don't know what song it was, but they did write a
Merton
song.
loved Bob Dylan, by the way. He called him the American villain. Villain being a famous, they say that Merton put on a recording of some of Dylan's songs and played them at full volume. The Dylan songs blasted the still atmosphere of Trappist lands with the wang-wang of guitars and voice at high amplification. So he loved both Baez and Dylan. Yeah. So anyway, I'll look it up, but that's very interesting. Thanks, Joe, Ellen, Joan.
Reverend Lana, go ahead.
Hi, good evening.
Good
It's
evening.
such a pleasure and honor to be here. And I must confess, I rediscovered you when going through some books in my library and started rereading The Coming of the Cosmic Christ. And I was floored by your connections you had made then of really very much where we are now with Christo-fascism and the analysis of, personality types of autocrats, and how you connected it to the native people who I've worked with and always have said were the indigenous people have always known who God was, because God was in the living things around them and they were reading it. And so this is sort of like a just broad range of commentary of just questions and thoughts. First of all, are you familiar with ecstatic naturalism that my professor, Robert Corrington at Drew Theological School, has written about, which really kind of seems to me to be the via positiva, as you would put it. I don't know if you've ever.
It sounds like it. I don't know that phrase myself, but
Okay.
it sounds like it. And the word ecstasy is very important in my writing and in Thomas Aquinas' writing. He uses that for our mystical experiences.
Absolutely.
And I do too. My Wee book, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, joy. I mean, I don't know what the search for God is, if not of joy, you know. So for me, and I completely concur with, you know, the fact that we have lost the playfulness that keeps us dynamic, and instead chose the static, you know, as you've said, the patriarchy and patristic theology killed everything, you know. And I always say, people don't realize there was matrilineal cultures for, you know, patriarchy is only 5,000 or 6,000 years old. We can get rid of this. Okay. We can get rid of this, and we can go back to the matrilineal and matriarchal really sharing and cooperation that many of the indigenous tribes also, you know, utilized. I mean, the phrase make no harm for 7 generations came from the matriarchal leadership of native tribes, because the women led the council. A man could be elected the leader, but the rule he had to follow before if he was not to be ejected, was he would cause no harm for 7 generations. How wise. Couldn't we live that way today? So I just want to say 1 or 2 more things. I've been enjoying and have purchased more of your books in the meantime. I tracked you down to see if you were, you know, around and got connected with this. I loved what you said about what he said about the moonshot. And don't you think that's because really the universe can be within? Why do we need to go so far externally to search things? Not that searching or experiencing things is ever a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. But really, can't we just experience it internally, or going, you know, in meeting God inside? So that was the one thing that I, you know, was wondering what you thought about that moonshot, you know, and why he said that.
Well, remember what he's saying. He says it's easier to go outside to search than it is to go inside.
Right. Good point.
But again, ideally, it could be both and, couldn't it?
It could.
And one serves the other, like the Webb telescope. Any day now is going to start delivering to our living rooms the light from the original universe, the original light of the universe, which is stunning when you think about it. You know, usually when we humans talk about light, we're talking about the sun, naturally, but it's only 5 billion years old. We're going to be seeing light that's 13 billion years old.
Yes.
That's amazing. And it feeds our sense of awe, and from awe comes wisdom. So, you know, it's both and, but the fact that Merton had the, you know, the discernment and the courage to speak out and say, you know, don't make an idol of these moonshots. Do something much harder, which is the inner work. And I mean, what if we have been working as hard on the inner work since 1969 as we've been working on getting things to other planets? You know, that's what he's saying, and I think it's important. I'd like to pick up your point on the wisdom of the indigenous people, because Merton had so much to say about it. And the whole thing about it being matriarchal, you know, one person who's written a marvelous book on Native American history called Beyond Geography says that he defines the Native tradition as Aboriginal mother love, Aboriginal mother love. So the role that Mother Earth plays, you see, and as you say, the role that the grandmothers play, the circle of grandmothers who have the final word about what's just and what isn't just, and what's, as you say, good for 7 generations and what isn't. But here's Merton. In a major poem called The Geography of La Guerre, written in 1968, his last year of life, he has these phrases talking about the conquest of the native peoples in the Americas.
Right.
Redneck captains with whips, fire in their fingers, friars behind every rock, every tree, doing business, bargaining for our souls, book burners and hangmen. I mean, that's pretty blunt, isn't it? Pretty out there.
It
And
is.
he talks about their rituals, a cosmic system that is perfectly sacred and perfectly worldly at the same time. One fell in step with the dance of the universe, the liturgy of the stars, he says.
Yes.
And then he has he mocks, he satirizes the ideology behind colonialism. And these are his words. The native peoples seemed to be owners of the whole continent until we arrived and informed them of the true situation. They were squatters on land which God had assigned to us.
Exactly.
We could see at a glance, we understood without the slightest hesitation that they were only Aboriginal owners. They never had any legal title to the real estate. And with the help of the military, we told them the truth, So, and he connects the Vietnam War to the oppression of the native people. He said, once again, we're beating up on people of color and working out of colonialist philosophy rather than working with equals,
Matthew, I just want to tell you that over 40 years ago, I went to law school for Native American defense when everybody was going to be a corporate raider. Part of that, and nobody knew what the heck I was doing. That was way before I went to divinity school. Part of my childhood, I grew up next to a Palestinian refugee camp. And seeing that at such a young age actually traumatized me, but put into me a very early, I always say that was where my theology and my advocacy came from. And, they are all connected. And that's why I was so appreciative when I ran into your works again. They're absolutely connected. And, I'm part of groups of people who are trying to do exactly what you say, trying to bring the pain and the frustration and the grief and the loss that is unacknowledged in our society into and transforming it, into a useful and healing and creative approach just for peace, just
Beautiful.
for peace.
Thank you for the work you've been doing all these years. And I think that's amazing that you went into law on the behalf of the indigenous people so many decades ago.
I did.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. I'm not going to take any more of your time, but
hopefully
I'll join again.
Yeah.
I will join in again at some point.
Thanks
Okay.
for sharing.
Okay.
Keep up your work.
Thank you.
Carol, unmute and go ahead.
Sarah? Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I lived in the Bay Area when you were in Oakland and was at the Presbyterian Church and found you and Merton through an English professor and went over to the Sisters of Mercy and continued learning and being. So it's wonderful to be with you. I am wondering about in New Seeds of Contemplation, he talks about faith as the beginning of contemplation and an intellectual assent. So I'd like to know a little bit about faith, but also, was he aware of Jungian psychology and the expansion of self? And did that integrate with some of his thought or not?
Pardon me. I'm just going to see right here. Yeah, there's a number of references in the book to Jung. So he certainly knew some Jung.
I ordered the book.
They were
It's on the
contemporary.
way.
What's that?
I ordered the book. It's on its way.
Yeah. But I'm trying to remember now that the first things you were talking about, you just asked about Jung, but you said something before that.
A new seeds of contemplation.
Oh, yes, what faith? Yeah, you want to know
Faith
about
at
faith.
the beginning and an intellectual assent, and then that's where I wonder how the rest of it comes in.
Well, yeah, I myself am not at home with the definition of faith as intellectual assent.
Okay.
That is from Augustine, and I think it's very heady and very male, and it's not scriptural. Trust is the word. Pistuein, the word that we translate as faith in the New Testament. For example, frequently when Jesus meets wounded people, physically or emotionally or otherwise, they'll interact, and then he will say, go your way, your blank has healed you. That word blank, we translate as faith, but it really means trust.
Okay.
The word in Greek, pistuein, means to trust. And so trust is really, I think, the deeper, the richer meaning of faith. And we have this danger, especially after 2,000 years, of having, when I hear the word faith and intellectual assent, I see piles of doctrines all the way up to the ceiling. And I don't think that's what faith is about at all. That's what churches do when and bureaucracies do. They pile papers. And so I just think there's a real danger in misunderstanding the word faith as an intellectual assent. Primarily, it's trust. And I'll tell you a real down-to-earth story. In the civil rights movement in Birmingham, there was a wonderful Black leader named Fred Shuttlesworth. And he was not highly educated like King was. He was a street minister. And he took on the Ku Klux Klan and so much else. And he's the one who convinced King to fill the jail with teenagers, because the jails, the adults who were in jail, he said, they have to go back to work. They're going to lose their jobs. They can't stay there over a month. But you have to keep filling the jails. That's the strategy, after all. And King did not want to do this, but finally he relented and he did it. And it saved the movement, really. But I was invited to have a public dialogue with Fred Shuttlesworth on the topic of racism and ecology at the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, which is, as I recall, right across the street from the church that was blown up on a Sunday where they killed 6 Black girls in church. And so before he and I went public, we were having lunch at a table, just 2 of us, sharing a sandwich. And I said to him, Fred, I have something to ask you. I said, because you see, his whole house had been blown up by the Ku Klux Klan and he was in it. And the whole roof caved in and he walked out alive. And they beat him 3 times with chains, the Ku Klux Klan did. They put his 2 children, I think 8 and 10 years old, in jail. That was Sheriff O'Connor. And he went through all this stuff, So at lunch, just before we were going to do a public dialogue, I said to him, I have one question for you, Fred. Where do you get your courage? And he said, you could call it courage, but I don't. I call it trust. When they blew up my house and I walked out alive, I said to myself, they can't kill me. Oh, they can kill my body someday, but they can't kill me, and they cannot kill the movement. Notice how he's thinking in terms of community, which is the Jewish way to think, not the comfortable white Christian way to think, because modern consciousness is all about the I. I think, therefore I am, Mr. Descartes. But I've never forgotten that. It's one of the most profound lessons I've learned in my life. And I think it's so important to ask people who are courageous where they get their courage. I think it's without doubt one of the most important issues in life. And the lack of courage on the part of so many within his party to respond to the crimes of the previous president and that resulted in January 6th and so much more, is part of the history of our society today in a big way. So we don't get anywhere without courage. Big heart, cœur large. But I've never forgotten that. Here's a man who's courageous. This guy has a PhD in courage. And by the way, that he wanted a public dialogue on ecology and racism. And this encounter we had must have been at least 15, maybe 20 years ago. I mean, he was way ahead on that subject. That subject is now getting some publicity, but he was way ahead. And he had been this street minister and so on. I mean, he had done so many courageous things, but he was also always thinking ahead. And the fact is that there's more dumps on Black property in Alabama than any place in the country. So that's part of racism, is the dumping of toxic waste in Black neighborhoods in LA, South LA, and in Alabama and so forth. But anyway, I share that with you. I think it's really important. That's the meaning of faith, to trust. And in the process, you build your courage and you do what you have to do, whether it makes you friends or enemies.
Thank you. I was just wondering about that sentence.
Jesus certainly wasn't wandering around writing up doctrines for people to be tested by. Was he? That's not the Jesus I encounter or find at all. He was stirring people's hearts and souls. Now, organizations have to have some rules. I know it's all part of, living under a roof. But to turn them into the meaning of faith is a scandal.
Thank you.
And let me say this about doctrines. I'm not against doctrines. I'm against the misuse of doctrines. Because here's the key word for doctrine is a word that maybe it was you who just brought it up, Sarah. Play. You should play with doctrines. Doctrines are like the parameters of a basketball court. Within those parameters, play your heart out. Let the reptilian brain play its heart out. But there are these parameters. And so, for example, something like the Trinity. I mean, it's utterly playful. You see the great stone doors, if not really doors, but at the beginning of the great shrine, ancient Neolithic shrine in Ireland, where the sun comes through one day a year, this winter solstice, my birthday. And what's on those great big old stone doors? 3 circles, 3 spirals. So that was thousands of years before anyone heard of Jesus, and certainly before the Nicene Creed. So the whole idea of thinking in terms of triplets, and as I say, 1 + 1 = 3. That's what parenting is, isn't it? And 3 is a magic number wherever you are. The Indians from India, they're all into 3s and trinities too. So, you want to play with the idea of Trinity. And one way to play is say, how many other people do it? How do they dance to a Trinity? So don't get bogged down in anything legalistic or literal. As Paul said, the letter kills, the spirit gives life. So the danger is literalism, and that's where doctrine gets really, really dangerous. And then they burn you at the stake if you're not literally on the same page. So doctrine becomes a bludgeon, not a source of creativity and imagination and play and fertility. Which is what any good doctrine does for you. It ignites you, it gets you excited and playful again. One sentence from Merton that means a lot to me is he said at one point, he said, we need a whole new priesthood, a priesthood that is not about the priest, that is not about one person. And that inspired me when I became Episcopalian and started to create these cosmic masses with young people where we brought rave into liturgy. So we dance and we have VJ and DJ, and rap, which is postmodern art forms. Just like in the 12th century, they brought stained glass in a big way. Well, why wouldn't we bring in the 21st century these new art forms that are so wonderful to pray with, worship with? But I've often thought back on that one line that I read in Merton some years ago, that we need to reinvent the entire priesthood, that it should not be about itself, and it should be about the community. So I wrote my book on the reinvention of work. I write about how if you're doing good work in the world, you are a priest, because archetypally, a priest I define a priest as a midwife of grace. And your good work in the world, like the woman who's been working as a lawyer on behalf of Indigenous people and then as a minister, that is a priesthood, and it's sacred. And that can be true of business people doing healthy business, and it can be true of carpenters and of artists and musicians and parenting and everything else. That we have to get away from the idea of a separate priesthood. Père Chanou, my mentor in France, he used to say that the Christian priesthood is not ritualistic so much that it is prophetic. It's a prophetic priesthood. And so anyway, we find in our cosmic masses this experience that everyone is a priest, because you're bringing the grace into the community that's there. The grace of the community is stirring it up, and you're there too, because you're dancing hard and you're giving generously of your sweat and of your prayers at the same time. So anyway, I think that's another gift from Merton, that he challenged the structure of the priesthood in his day.
We have time for a few more questions. Carol?
Yes, Carol Voights from Michigan, and I wanted to ask a couple of questions about, I am a Quaker and I was raised Methodist, but anyway, I feel like I came through to cosmology and these mystics through my Quakerism, and I never hear George Fox or Margaret Fuller mentioned as mystics, and yet they to me embodied their whole theology, but they didn't have much theology. It was there is light in everyone and in everything, and your job is to find it. And then it was Bayard Rustin. I wondered if Thomas Merton had visited with Bayard Rustin, the gay Quaker sidekick of Martin Luther King, who convinced King that the civil rights movement needed to be nonviolent. So I wanted to know if Thomas Merton put much stock in the Quakers.
Yes, I think he had a lot of respect for the Quakers, and rightly so. I'll tell you a story. The very first time I lectured on Eckhart was in a Quaker house in, I think, Highland Park, Illinois, outside Chicago. It's a Chicago suburb. And I lectured for an hour. And at the end of my talk, the woman who ran the place was a big, strong woman. I think she posed for the Arm & Hammer sort of box. She was in the back room. She bellowed forward. She said, "My God," she said, "that sounds exactly like George Fox." So I've often said that, when because Eckhart brought together contemplation and action, or the words mysticism and prophecy, and like George Fox did. And I've often said that when he was condemned, you see, Eckhart's marriage of action and contemplation went underground. And it came up in the radical Protestants, Hans Dank and Hutt and so forth. But it really came up with George Fox. I think that George Fox is very much in the lineage of Meister Eckhart. And of course, there's so much to respect there, and including the bottom line teaching of silence, and of silence as a avenue to truth and to light, and the light in all of us. Eckhart made a big thing of the spark of the soul. He gave a lot of talks where he would refer to the spark of the soul and say he got the idea from Avicenna, the Muslim philosopher who lived, 300 years before him. So George Fox is part of that lineage, and I have tremendous respect for him. And I'm sorry, the woman you mentioned too, the name is escaping me.
Bayard Rustin was
No, the woman, you mentioned a woman.
Margaret Fuller was his
Margaret
wife.
Fuller, exactly, yeah. So that, I think that tradition has so much going for it. And you know, they've been ahead on so many social issues, including slavery in the 19th century and all that. So anyway, I have a lot of respect for it. And I think that Merton did too. Let me even see again if there's references to it or to. See that, but maybe George Fox here. I'm sure he wrote about George Fox
Okay.
at times, but I don't see it in my book here. But anyway, yeah, the Quaker tradition needs a shout out for what they've accomplished over the years, and I think they've kept in many ways a monastic consciousness alive in the world. So the contemplation is deep and important, but so is the action. And so I think there's richness there.
Do you have any inkling as whether Thomas Merton ever crossed paths with Bayard Rustin?
No, I don't know that. Let me see if his name is in my. No, I don't. It's RUS, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, he's not mentioned in my book, but he could have. You could Google it or
Okay.
something. I wouldn't be surprised if they did cross paths.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Marie, go ahead.
Hi,
Hello.
thank you so much for this offering, and for all the people here showing up and sharing. It's wonderful. And I am actually working with the Rolling Ridge Retreat Center, the group there, and I led a retreat there it was a couple of weeks ago on touching the earth on the path to awakening. And it's a lot about the Buddhist teachings, but I was raised Christian and I raised my children Jewish, and I've done a lot of multi-faith, and I still practice multi-faith and I love it. But I feel like I was listening to so many points, and I have the 7-story mountain and I haven't read the whole thing. And I started, I went back to school to find my voice, and I started all this MBSR stuff, mind body stress reduction, and went into Buddhism and started traveling. And experiential is the way I learn. I can't really read a lot and hold it and comprehend it. I've been, I have a chronic illness and it affects my cognitive skills. So I do experiential work, but then I was sitting and meditating and learning all these Buddhist traditions, and found such a joy and relief, and such a beautiful sacred space out in the woods. We would have to go on 10-day silent retreats and not talk to anyone and just do walking and nature. And then I came back and I was like, well, what about Christians? What do we do in Christianity? And I asked the priest, and he's like, no, that's not for lay people. And I was like, what do you mean? And why are we just pray? We never listen to God. We have to listen, right? And he was like, no, this isn't for lay. So I went and talked to these nuns, and I stayed over, and they're like, we'll do our contemplation. They got up at 6:30, but I wasn't being fed. And then finally I found, I did a report, a paper on Thomas Keating and the Desert Mothers and Fathers, and heard about Merton and all this stuff. And I was like, this is what it is. And then I found Richard Rohr. And so I've done a lot of the Lectio Divina that he proposed. But then I just read your book on original blessings. And I'm just so grateful for all of these practices. And I feel like I practice all of them in all different ways. And I teach the worship in the woods now at the Rolling Ridge. And we go out and we just show up to us in any way of nature that you're going to show us that you're here, and God or whatever deity you want to talk to, because everyone is so different now. I want to include all the cultures and study the similarities and not the differences, because they divide everyone. But I feel like I so relate to everything you were saying, and I love the conversation. But how did Merton get started, and what did he do for his contemplation and being in silence? Was it part of his life? Because I've tried to make it part of my lifestyle now, where I'm trying to be aware. It's just awareness, right? Of being aware of everything we do, to be present so we're not distracted. And to me, that's being silent using our senses. That's what I was taught anyway. So I feel like, I don't know, how did he go into his silence? Was it just in the monastery, or, I mean, I don't know. Is there anything that he talks about on that? How he practiced his silence?
Oh yeah, he writes a lot about that, about how to do it, like in his New Seeds of Contemplation and so forth. But remember, he was part of a structure. That's what the monastery offers, where they had time for prayer that was singing the Psalms. And of course, they had a lot of Gregorian chant back then too, which is beautiful in itself. It actually comes from the synagogue, Gregorian chant comes from the synagogue originally. And what you're singing is the Psalms. So that comes from the synagogue too, obviously.
Yeah,
so
so I love that. I love the singing of the Psalms. So that's what he did, a lot of that. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's amongst you every day. And as I said, in the middle of the night, they get up to do it too. And but they also had silent time, where they do more contemplative meditation. And as you say, more listening than just talking. And that was part of his routine for many, many years. Again, he joined in 1940 and he died in 1968. It's interesting too, it seems that he joined the monastery and died on the same day, December 10th.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of synchronistic.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me though.
But of course, I also emphasized art as meditation, which is another way of praying, as I say. Yeah, whether photography.
Yeah, creativity, I understand that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had multiple ways to pray. And of course, when he went east, especially, and even in America with Zen and everything, he found fellow meditators from the East who would do Zen practice, for example.
Okay.
And of course, he and the Dalai Lama would meditate together and so forth. And he and Thich Nhat Hanh. So like you, he was interfaith and he was reaching out. And again, he was a pioneer. There were some others doing that. Father B. Griffiths in India was doing that. He was a Benedictine. And the Trappists are really a son of the Benedictines, if you will, a child of the Benedictines.
Yeah.
And but they're stricter. And then of course, as I said earlier, part of their practice is not to talk. It's kind of Quaker-like, as if the whole day is like a Quaker meeting where you're supposed to be silent. And, you as a young monk, you could talk to your novice master or something like that, but you weren't supposed to be chatting with each other. And they loosened those rules up a little bit, but that too was trying to create a context of silence. Yeah. And of course, the work was very important. The basic work of the monastery was farming. Yeah. And, and making cheese and making whatever, liquor or whatever else they make. And that's how they survive too. But so he talks a lot about the farm, and I gave the story about his interaction with Silent Spring author. So that was finding prayer in your work. That is part of the Benedictine tradition too. So, so silence and solitude play a very big role in their structured lives. But times of contemplation. And I was glad to hear when you shared some of your story with us about how you found Father Keating, because I think that Father Keating has kind of boiled down with his centering prayer some practical ways for people to get into their right hemisphere of their brain, is how I'd put it, or to tame the reptilian brain, or to meditate. And it's something to realize that we have today a smorgasbord of meditation practices, you know, from the East and indigenous and Western too. So it's not that we're short on meditation practices. I think we're short on making the time and making it a value for us. But it certainly was a value for Merton. But again, in 1958, he got wings from Meister Eckhart and Suzuki that put him into the fray of human history.
Yeah.
And if it's true, and I think it's 95% certain, that he died a martyr for being a peace activist,
yeah,
and a peace preacher who coached the Berrigan brothers, who, as you may recall, or those who are old enough, were being chased by the FBI all over America and spent many years in jail, etc. And the Catholic worker movement and all that. And of course, Merton was close to Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. So he married a life of activism with contemplation. And in that way, he was like George Fox, who also got himself in trouble and in jail.
I like that you bring that up. I like to do activism work too, and I do a lot of sitting out in Cambridge City Hall with my signs saying we're facing the crisis and just trying to make people aware of stuff. But I feel like, what was I going to tell you? Oh, yeah, I'm running a compost. And so the active work where Joanna Macy has a good program on active hope. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And I did a whole practice on faith and trust one time too. And I love that you're talking about trust as being faith, because that's what I found. But I feel like when we do the active hope, I did her program and it really is inspirational. Like, how do we stay where we are in this chaotic world and without going crazy, right? So we're running a composting program. It's like we're trying to create an eco-spirituality center with the Rolling Ridge to create everybody welcome there. It's Methodist kind of run, you know, it's been that for a long time, but it's really open. So we're going to do a composting program to get people in touch with the earth, because we need to give back, regenerate the soil, save Mother Earth. We're all connected, right? Animals, earth, bugs.
Right.
Sun, things. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. This has been
Thank
wonderful.
you, everybody. I think our time is full now.
Mm.
Who's there? Is it Dennis or?
Do you have time for one more question from Janet? Do we have time, Dennis?
Quick question.
It does happen to be quick. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll chime in with my thanks also, Matthew, for all the wonderful work you do. I read many years ago a book by Jerry Mander called In the Absence of the Sacred.
Uh-huh.
And I was just wondering, I also just watched the hearings today, and I've been watching a lot of them this week. There's a lot of discussion about technology and the influence of social media and so forth. And in Jerry Mander's book, of course, he brings up this idea of technology not being neutral, and then he certainly ends with the struggle of the Native peoples against a lot of what this technology is trying to do to their lives and what has been done and what has hurt them. So I was wondering if you could just comment on that, because I'm feeling rather hopeless in terms of the belief of people in a lot of the social media. And although I try to say that's not going to influence things, it certainly has and has a lot of concerns in my mind. So I didn't know if you could just close with a few comments on that.
Well, Merton talks about technology a lot. He actually uses the phrase technological barbarism. He says technology is not evil, but it is not beyond all criticism either. If used cynically and opportunistically for power and wealth, it becomes a disastrous weapon against humanity and is the instrument by which the demons crush and humiliate and destroy humanity. Witness the Vietnam War. Of course, he was living at the time of the war. And in an article in 1965, he said, the mere rejection of modern technology as an absolute and irredeemable evil will not solve any problems. The harm done by technology is attributable more to its excessive and inordinately hasty development than to technology itself. Now, I think that's very important and insightful. The whole social media thing, Twitter and all that, we invent these things and we haven't at all anticipated their shadow side, right? It's I just think that one sentence is really important. The harm done is the hasty development. It is possible that in the future, a technological society might, in italics, conceivably be a tranquil and contemplative one. And he calls for a wisdom appropriate to our own predicament. And such wisdom cannot help but begin in sorrow. That wisdom begins in sorrow. So he has quite a lot to say about technology that I bring out in this book. And I think is really right on regarding a lot of it. And especially that one observation, we keep turning out all these new gadgets, but we don't pause to ask, what happens when the wrong people get hold of this stuff? When people want to spread lies faster.
Well, and then that leads to, of course, the lack of regulation and the runaway monopoly of all of that. But one thing I thought that was interesting is that even before all social media, the photos in Vietnam of the people who had been burned by napalm certainly made a tremendous impression on the American people and certainly helped turn the tide against what we were doing. And those were photographs.
Well, and the same is true of the civil rights movement. That television, black and white television screens, we saw dogs unleashed by the police in Birmingham and these horrible hoses and everything. I mean, it came into our living rooms in the North and kind of woke some people up. This is serious. This is killing, and it's been done in the name of the state and the name of the police and all this. So that's part of postmodern politics, to incorporate the technology. Now, here's a good example. I sat down with the founder of Greenpeace, or one of the founders of Greenpeace, and he told me this story. That they started out as an anti-nuclear movement, but then they wanted to get into ecology. And so they had a seminar for like several weeks asking one question: how do we get the word about ecology into people's living rooms, if you will? And then they said, well, of course, you have to have television and you have to do something crazy to get on television. So that's when they came up with this idea. We will chase whale boats in dinghies, but with a camera, with a television camera. So that's how Greenpeace was born. They chased these big whaling ships in little skiffs with a television camera, and that is how Greenpeace was born. So that's postmodern politics, you see, where you incorporate the technology, especially around communication. But again, a warning, this can be used also by the enemies of justice and peace. And that's why some presidents got kicked off of Twitter. So with that, I want to thank everybody.
Thank
I've got to
you.
be moving. Thank you, Lori, for your hospitality.
Oh, thank you, Matthew.
Dennis for his help. And thank you all for participating. A pleasure.
Thank you all so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but I will send those to Dennis, and hopefully Matthew, he'll send those on to you and you can answer those and we'll email them back. So thank you all. Please join us on July 14th for Thomas Aquinas, and have a wonderful month. Thank you, Matthew. Wonderful.
Thank you. Blessings.